Hello everyone, and welcome to my session, Stick to Your DITA Standards, using Schematron to add custom DITA validation to AEM guides.
Since day one, we've been determined to change the world. Our devices placed the office in the palm of your hand and changed how we work, forever. Our vision has expanded. Now we're pairing artificial intelligence with our trusted security and putting it everywhere. For too long, security was about what you stopped, but the Internet of Things is making everything smarter, including cyber threats. We've never been more connected or more vulnerable. As ransomware and cybercrime explode, security needs to do more. It needs to stay ahead of threats. It needs to keep you safe. It needs to be intelligent. Prevention is the best medicine. This is especially true for IT systems. Much like vaccines prevent infection, our intelligent security is a prevention-first approach that stops cyber attacks before they can launch. If there is a breach, we have remediation solutions and services ready and in place. We help our customers solve their most critical security challenges. We protect more than 500 million endpoints, including over 195 million cars. We have design wins with 23 of the top 25 electric vehicle OEMs, ensuring vehicle safety and security. 45 of Fortune 100 companies trust us with their security. Our security is NIAP certified as classified. It is the highest security level awarded for government and industry. While cybersecurity lets you stop threats, intelligent security gives you the freedom to reach higher, go further, and dream bigger. Blackberry Intelligent Security lets you change the world again.
Guides. My name is Marco Cacciacarro, and I am the manager of the Enterprise Documentation team at Blackberry, based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. To answer the two questions that you probably have right off the bat, yes, this is the same Blackberry that produced phones years ago, and no, we are no longer in the business of phones. Blackberry has transformed itself over the years into a leader in the enterprise software space, specializing in mobility management products, cybersecurity, and IoT. And we have a host of other security and business productivity offerings in our wide portfolio. My team produces the customer documentation for all of the enterprise software products that Blackberry offers. If you're curious, you can check it all out on docs.blackberry.com. Our team has a long history with DITA, starting back when I was a student writer over 16 years ago. My first project in the wonderful wide world of tech writing involved helping Blackberry sort out the transition from unstructured authoring in FrameMaker to structured authoring in a DITA CCMS. Blackberry has been a proud leader in the DITA space, carrying it over the years through three different component content management systems. First Contenta, then Ixiasoft, and now AEM Guides. We made the transition to Guides about 5 years ago, and we've never looked back. Over the years, our team has developed our own unique standards and practices for DITA authoring, with goals of promoting minimalism, achieving consistency, and streamlining our use of elements to produce clean documentation that is easy to use and easy to navigate. A few examples of some standards that we enforce in our use of DITA. We stick to the use of the standard table element rather than the choice table or simple table elements, as we've put the most effort into the visual formatting and presentation of standard tables. When everyone uses the same table element, tables look consistent across our content. We limit the use of note elements within topics to ensure that they have maximum impact and draw the attention of the reader. When notes are overused, they lose a lot of their impact. General guidance is to limit the use of notes to one per topic. We also don't hard code height and width values on image elements, as this can result in images getting distorted in output. Instead, we ensure that the proper sizing is set on the source image in Photoshop or Illustrator before we import it into Guides. These are just a few examples of many practical standards that we've developed for our use of DITA. None of them involve strict syntax problems or violations of base DITA standards. They are simply conscious decisions that we've made to maximize the impact, presentation, and clarity of our content. A key challenge that we faced over the years. What is the best way to teach and enforce our DITA standards and practices to our writers? We pass content through reviews with a dedicated technical editor, we provide extensive training, and we document and maintain authoring guidelines that our writers can refer to at any time. All of these methods work to a degree, but mistakes or oversights can always slip through the cracks. Failure to follow our DITA standards and practices is not strictly wrong as far as DITA goes, so the built-in XML validation in the guide's web editor can't really do anything about it. The impact of not following our standards can be as minor as missing alt text on an image, or as major as a failed PDF or HTML output due to a few misconfigured XREF elements. We've always wrestled with the question of how we could build in some form of automated checking to help our writers learn and follow our standards. The release of AEM Guides 4.1 last year introduced a new feature that finally gave us the answer to this long-standing question. Guides introduced support for the Schematron XML validation standard, giving us the ability to integrate custom validation rules with the AEM Guides topic editor. My presentation today will focus on what Schematron is and why it is valuable to DITA authors. I'll give a demo of Schematron validation in action. I'll cover the basics of writing Schematron rules. I'll share examples of rules that we have implemented. And finally, I'll share some resources that you can use to get started building your own Schematron config. So what is Schematron? It's an XML validation language that uses XPath expressions to construct and apply custom XML validation rules. You can use it with any type of XML, but of course the focus today will be on its applications for DITA authoring. Invented by Rick Jelliff in the late 90s into early 2000s, Schematron is a popular XML validation standard with applications across many industries. According to schematron.com, it is a language for making assertions about the presence or absence of, of patterns in linked XML documents. Now, to put that in very simple terms, Schematron just allows you to run an automated process on a given sample of XML content to determine whether it follows the rules that you define. You can use Schematron to build a collection of specific validation rules. Each rule can be used to do the following for a given DITA topic. Locate all instances of a specific DITA element. Set out a rule for the contents of that element. Determine whether the rule is followed or broken. If the rule is followed, the element is valid. If the rule is broken, the element is not valid, and you can display a custom error message to the user to guide them to correct the issue. Now, to give a quick disclaimer, I'm no expert in Schematron. I'm just a tech writer who is curious about new features that we can exploit and use to our benefit in AEM Guides. Last year, I attended a demo session for a pending upgrade of Guides and learned that they added support for Schematron. I saw the potential that it had to automate the enforcement of our standards, so I asked Adobe for some guidance about how I could learn about and use it. The Guides team gave me a sample Schematron configuration and pointed me to some very helpful demos and resources from Eric Siegel, a prominent Schematron expert. After spending some time with those resources, I was able to use what I learned to translate a wish list of DITA standards to specific Schematron rules that my team was able to test, validate, and eventually implement in our daily authoring. Hopefully, what I'll cover today will serve as a jumpstart to help you on your own journey to integrate Schematron with AEM Guides. To get started, I thought it would be helpful to provide a demo of the actual experience of Schematron DITA validation within the Guides topic editor. So we'll jump over here to our actual instance of AEM Guides version 4.1. And what I've done here for the sake of this demo is just set up a very simple sample concept topic. So we'll open it up here in the editor. It's just got some very basic lorem ipsum sample text, and what I'm going to do right now is to intentionally introduce some errors that violate the Schematron validation rules that we've configured. So I'm going to delete the contents of this paragraph tag to set up the dreaded MTP tag for spacing, one of my personal pet peeves. In this unordered list here, it's got two list item elements. I'm going to delete one of them so that we have an unordered list with only a single list item. I'm going to duplicate this note here so that the same parent element of con body now has two note elements within it. Call that note number 2. Here we have an internal link to another topic. I'm going to mess it up by basically changing the scope of it from local to external. And for this web link, our requirements are that the format is set to HTML and the scope is set to external. I'm going to mess it up by removing the format equals HTML attribute. So I've now introduced some violations of our DITA standards into the topic. And before I run the Schematron validation by clicking save, I'll quickly show you how the Schematron config has been added to the system. So I am a CMS admin for the system. So within the editor settings here, we have a validation tab. So this is our Schematron configuration file, which we'll discuss quite a bit within this presentation. All you need to know right now is that it contains all of our validation rules using the specific syntax that Schematron requires. I've uploaded it as an administrator, and I've set it to run the validation check whenever any user clicks save or save as new version. That's what that checkbox here means. Run validation check before saving the file. So that's how we have configured the Schematron validation to run. I'll go over both options that you have for running the validation a little bit later on. But for now, just know that in our system, it's configured to run whenever a user clicks save. So we'll do that right now. I've introduced those intentional violations here. I'm going to click the save, and it's going to instantly run the Schematron validation process. It's going to throw up this message that tells me that the file is not saved because various rules have been broken. In my validation panel to the right here, we have an error for every issue that has now occurred, plus the specific error message that I have put in the configuration file to inform the user of what the problem is. So whenever you click the error, it gets highlighted. This one, the error and the issue is actually with the con body parent element that has multiple notes, which is why the whole thing is highlighted there. The external link here is highlighted, and so on and so forth. So let's go about fixing these problems so that I can save this topic. So it tells me the bulleted list must have more than one item. So I'll correct that issue by adding in list item number 2. I'll eliminate the empty paragraph tag to get rid of that problem. I'll eliminate note number 2 to eliminate that problem of more than one note being present within the parent element. So now I'll just rerun the validation to show you that these 5 errors will now go down to 2. Okay, so the problem I still have here is with my links. So again, it's going to give me guidance here. In order to fix this web link, I need to go into the properties and I need to set the format back to HTML. And for this internal link to another topic, I need to change the scope from external to local. Now, when I run the save again, my validation is passed and my topic has now been saved. And the same validation check will happen when I save as new version as well. It'll do another validation check for me. So now that I've demonstrated the end goal of what can be accomplished, let me dive into the essentials of how you can use Schematron and XPath expressions to build your custom DITA validation rules. So something that I learned very quickly is that your Schematron implementation can be as simple or as complex as you need or want it to be. There are many online resources that you can use to learn the ins and outs of Schematron and XPath expressions, and I'll share a list of some before we conclude today. Thankfully, it's not that hard to grasp the essentials and translate that understanding to actual Schematron syntax. Before I jump into the specifics, I'll clarify that Guides gives you 2 options when it comes to running the XML validation. The soft or optional method, where writers can upload the config and run it whenever they want to, or the hard or mandatory method, where you upload the config as an administrator and have it run whenever a writer clicks save or save as new version. When you use this method, the writer has to correct any errors before they can save the topic. We opted for the mandatory method because we consider the Schematron rules that we've configured to be reasonable standards that all of our writers should be following. What I'll walk you through now is the basic anatomy of a Schematron config. to give you a better understanding of how you can move from the concept of a rule to the actual implementation of that rule. To implement Schematron rules, you need a Schematron configuration file, which is basically just a text file with the .sch extension. This file has standard info at the start and end that defines the version of XSLT to use, the title of your configuration. The example here is just Enterprise Docs Schematron Config. It's just a friendly title. And a parent schema wrapper that will contain everything that you define in the file. So this little dots here represents everything that the real contents of the Schematron configuration that has my patterns and rules, which I'll explain in a moment. But really, your config file setup just requires this whole parent wrapper that defines this overall metadata for your configuration file. The real meat and potatoes of the config file are the patterns and rules that guide the automated validation process in your DITA topics. Every pattern translates to a specific standard that you want the Schematron validation to look for and enforce. A pattern is a collection of one or more rules. To start with a simple example, the following is a pattern that will flag any unordered list or ordered list that does not have at least 2 list items. So the important thing to note right now is that there is a pattern opening tag and closing tag that will contain all of your rules. And we'll dive into every aspect of a pattern in the following slides now. The first thing that you do within the pattern is define the context, which is the element that you want the automated validation to check. Continuing with this example, you want to validate unordered list and ordered list elements, so those elements become your context. So we have the rule context here being pointed at unordered list for the first rule and ordered list for the second rule. Next, we set out the specific rules that we want to use for the validation. You define each rule, and the validation process will determine whether the rule is observed or broken. There are 2 types of rules in Schematron: assert tests and report tests. Report tests are not currently supported by guides, so we'll narrow our focus to assert tests. Assert tests are used to set out a rule that the target XML syntax must follow. Rule construction is based on XPath 1.0 expressions, offering many options to build your rules. Staying with our list example, the assert tests here take account of list item elements and set out a requirement that more than one must be present within the unordered list or ordered list parent. Lastly, the text that is contained within the assert test determines the error message that is displayed to the writer if the rule is not satisfied. You write the error message string yourself, which is very useful for reminding writers about the standards that they need to follow. In this case here, if the count list item greater than 1 rule is broken for unordered list or ordered list, the text, a bulleted list or a numbered list, must have more than 1 item is displayed to the user, giving them guidance on how to resolve the problem. So that covers the basic construction of a Schematron pattern that defines a standard that you want to enforce for your DITA authors. Before I show you some real-world examples of patterns that my team has implemented, I'll cover some of the common options that you have when building XPath 1.0 expressions. This is a very small sample of what's available to you, basically the options that I found us revisiting a few times as we figured out how to build our patterns and assert tests. So first off, commenting. As with any markup language, you can comment out certain pieces of text or syntax in your configuration file. You can use this to add descriptions or explanations, or to turn off certain patterns that you're currently evaluating or revising. So in the example I've provided here, I use commenting to name all of the patterns that I have within our configuration file, just to help me orient myself. And I also have descriptions that I've given to each pattern so that I understand right off the bat, okay, this is my rule for unordered lists, this is my rule for notes, and so on and so forth. If you want your rules to check the attributes of elements, you can use the @ sign to signal which attributes you want to factor into your rules. For example, in this case, we have a rule with the context set to the xref element, which we use for internal and external links. The assert test sets out the rule that every XREF element must include a scope attribute, and the error message indicates what the scope attribute must be set to for different types of links. So for every XREF element within a topic, the requirement is that the scope attribute must be present. If the scope attribute is not present and the rule that I've set out is broken, that error message is displayed to the user, telling them what the scope must be set to and what the how it must be set for web links and for local links. You can use wildcard characters to signify that you want the rule to apply to any DITA element. In this example, we've created a rule where no DITA element should contain more than one note element to preserve the impact of notes when we choose to use them. Now, this is a universal rule that we want to apply to any parent DITA element. That's why we set the rule context to the wildcard, because we want this rule to apply to all DITA elements across the board. I've shown the count expression a few times already, which can be very helpful when you want to put in place some standards around how specific elements should be used. For example, if you want to make sure that unordered or ordered lists are truly lists that contain more than one item, or to ensure that a given parent element contains a maximum of a single note element. Count expressions are also good examples to show how you can use operators such as greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and so on to define your rules. You can also use other operators like does not equal when you want to build rules that prohibit certain values for attributes. For example, this rule flags image elements that have a blank value for the alt text attribute. So again, the rule context is pointing at images. So whenever there's an image, the rule states that the alt attribute must not be blank. If it is blank, then it displays this error message to the user, telling them to add alt text. You can leverage not expressions when you want to set out rules for the elements or attributes that you do not want writers to use in specific contexts. For example, we created this rule to prevent the use of table elements within the prerequisite element. So for prerequisites, if there is a table element present, the rule is broken and the user gets the message that prereq elements should not contain tables. You can also use or statements when building your rules to address more than one element or attribute within the same rule. For example, this rule defines that users should not apply conditional attributes to command elements within a task, but should instead apply the attribute to the step element. The not statement in the assert test uses or to address all of the attribute types that we leverage in our DITA content. So you can see here, not attribute audience or attribute other props or attribute platform or attribute product. So that was just a small sample of the many options you have when building Schematron rules. There are various XPath resources available online, some of which I'll share later on, that you can leverage to understand the full scope of options you have for building DITA validation rules. Now to pull all of this together, I'll show you some of the real-world rules that we have active in guides today and explain our logic for why we have these rules in place. First, we can return to an example that I mentioned previously. When we use images in our DITA content, we instruct writers to avoid hard coding height and width values for the image in the syntax, as this can easily result in images getting distorted in the output. We want writers to follow templates and sizing standards for images using Photoshop or Illustrator, such that images are already properly sized when we import the PNG files into AEM. To enforce this rule, we created the following pattern. The context specifies that the rules apply to any image element in a topic. Both assert tests use not statements along with the height and width attributes respectively to set out a rule that neither attribute should be present in the image element. If either attribute is present, the user is shown an error message that instructs them to remove the attribute and ensure that the proper sizing is enforced in the image itself. The next set of rules focus on the proper configuration of internal links within the same DITA map and external links to websites. In all my years as a CMS admin, The misconfiguration of XREF elements is probably the most common cause of output errors and broken or non-functional links in PDF and HTML output. The ability to create patterns to catch and correct these issues at the source is a huge win in my books. This is the pattern that we built to ensure the proper configuration of web links. The context specifies that the rule applies to any XREF element with an href attribute that contains a value with HTTP or HTTPS. So in other words, a URL. The assert test defines two rules. The scope attribute must be present and must have a value of external. And the format attribute must be present and must be set to a value of HTML. If either condition is not met, the user is shown an error message that instructs them to set these attributes properly. Likewise, we've implemented a similar rule for the proper configuration of internal links between topics that exist in the same DITA map. The context specifies that the rule applies to any XREF element where the href attribute does not start with HTTP or HTTPS. So in other words, a link to another topic in the CCMS, not a URL. The assert test defines two conditions. The scope attribute must be present and must have a value of local, and the format attribute must not be present. It's only required for web links. If either condition is not met, the user is shown an error message that instructs them to set these attributes properly. The last example focuses on ensuring that our writers use the proper DITA elements. DITA offers a wide selection of possible elements that can be used, but over the years we've curated a specific list of elements that we want writers to utilize, and we've developed our output formats to style these elements in specific ways. To achieve consistency in the look and feel of our docs, we want writers to stick to the approved list of DITA elements. To this end, we created the following pattern to flag DITA elements that we don't want writers to use. Now, for the sake of limited space on this slide here, this is a very truncated list where we only list the first 4 disallowed elements. The true list in our configuration file is much longer. The context uses a wildcard value, meaning that it will check every element in a topic. The assert test defines one rule that names multiple elements. In other words, it's an expression to indicate that none of the following elements should be used within the topic. If the rule is broken and any of the named DITA elements are used, the user is shown an error message that indicates that that specific element is not supported. I thought it would also be helpful to give you a quick overview of our implementation process. The first step involved compiling a wish list of the standards that we wanted the Schematron validation to enforce. We spent about 2 weeks compiling the list and refining it to a final version that we felt was achievable. The key here was to identify rules that we felt could realistically be translated to an XPath expression, could be comfortably enforced on a large scale across all of our DITA content, and would not feel too heavy-handed for writers. Once we had our list, the next step was to actually learn how to write them in Schematron syntax. Adobe gave me a basic sample and pointed me to recorded demo sessions by Eric Siegel. His sessions were very useful because they included many exercises that built my knowledge gradually. After working on that for 2 or 3 weeks or so, I felt I had a good grasp of the essentials and was able to figure out how to translate our wish list items into functional XPath expressions. I was able to test my rules using a command line Schematron validation tool, using sample DITA topics that I set up with intentional errors in the syntax. The guides team was also very helpful, answering my questions and pointing me in the right direction when I wasn't able to figure out the syntax on my own. Also, a big thank you as well to Pulkit Nagpal on the guides team. He always responded promptly and gave me excellent guidance when I needed it. The next stage was to test the Schematron configuration within AEM guides and refine the rules accordingly. I was very fortunate to have a super keen student writer, his name was Raj, who really put the Schematron configuration through its paces, testing it with over 40 sample topics copied from our real-world content. He identified which rules worked exactly as intended, which ones we had to tweak or adjust because of use cases that we had not anticipated, and which rules we actually decided to pull back because we found them to be too restrictive or problematic. He also took a real interest in learning more about XPath and gained enough knowledge to improve how I had initially written a lot of our assert tests. All in all, we spent about 3 weeks testing the Schematron config. Once we had reached a point in our testing where we were happy with the results and it was working as we expected and wanted, we formally rolled the Schematron validation out to our users. I led a session for our writers, walked them through all the rules, showed the feature in action, and then a few days later enabled it for everyone in our production environment. For about 2 to 3 weeks following the official rollout, we identified a few more edge cases and tweaks that we needed to make and updated the config accordingly. At the time of this recording, we've had our Schematron config live for writers for about 2 months, and it's working out great. In my own experience and based on feedback from teammates, it has had a significant impact on the quality of our DITA content, helping us identify and fix errors as a natural part of the authoring process. So as promised, here are a few helpful resources that I ended up using to learn more about Schematron and kind of learn how to translate my ideas to actual syntax. Of course, you don't have to write this all down now. You can watch the recording later on. But I would definitely recommend taking a look at Eric Siegel's Schematron tutorials. He's also authored books about Schematron. So there's a ton of content out there for you to dive into. At that first URL right there, there's intro and prep materials for his sessions. If you search for Eric Siegel Schematron tutorial on YouTube, you can find the two-part demo session that he led that I found super helpful. And all of the resources for those sessions are found at that GitHub URL there. There's also a really handy introduction to Schematron at xml.com, a great reference for XPath functions that my student writer Vraj used quite a bit when he was translating ideas into syntax or kind of refining what I had initially written. You can always reach out to the guides team for a sample Schematron file to get you started. I'm more than happy to share with you our Schematron file containing all of the stuff that I talked about today. If you'd like to use that as a starting point or see how we've done things, you can feel free to reach out to me at mcacciacarro@blackberry.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. I should be the only Marco Cacciacarro on there. And of course, you can leverage the Adobe Experience League community to post questions and ask for help from Adobe and other users to help create and refine your rules. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has attended this session. Hopefully it has helped you understand the potential of Schematron to improve your day-to-day data authoring and has pointed you in the right direction if you'd like to learn more and try to create your own Schematron config. And thank you again to Adobe for extending the invite for me to present here today. I enjoyed it very much. And thanks again to everyone.